Picture this. You're standing on an African plain, but it's nothing like the world you know. The air is thick with dust from distant deserts, and the ground trembles beneath your feet. In the distance, creatures so massive they dwarf modern elephants move across the horizon. Suddenly, a roar pierces the silence, not from one predator, but from several, each more terrifying than anything alive today. And somewhere in this nightmare landscape, a small group of peculiar primates huddles around a fire, their eyes scanning the darkness. They don't know it yet, but they're your ancestors. And if they make one wrong move tonight, you'll never exist. Welcome to Earth 300,000 years ago. A world so alien, so dangerous, and so magnificent that it would test the very limits of human survival. And if you're fascinated by the epic story of how we made it through, smash that like button and subscribe, because what you're about to discover will change how you see our species forever. 300 millennia ago, our planet was locked in the grip of a Pleistocene glacial cycle, a period of climate extremes that would make modern climate change look tame by comparison. This was a planetary transformation that reshaped continents and determined which species lived and which vanished into extinction. Massive ice sheets, kilometers thick, spread from the poles like frozen tsunamis moving in slow motion. These glaciers advanced century after century, swallowing entire mountain ranges and pushing sea levels down by dozens of meters. Coastlines that we'd never recognize today stretched hundreds of kilometers beyond their modern boundaries. What are now separate landmasses were connected by vast terrestrial bridges, creating superhighways for ancient migrations that would determine the genetic makeup of species for hundreds of thousands of years to come. But here's what makes this period truly fascinating. Earth wasn't uniformly frozen. Instead, it was a patchwork of extreme environments, each creating its own evolutionary pressure cooker. In Africa, the cradle of our species, the climate oscillated between devastating droughts and periods of abundance. Dense rainforests contracted and expanded like breathing lungs. Savannas spread during dry periods, only to retreat when the rains returned. Rivers that were mighty torrents during wet seasons became mere trickles during droughts, forcing every species to adapt or die. This constant environmental instability created something extraordinary, a testing ground that would forge the most adaptable species the planet had ever seen. Move north to Europe, and you'd encounter an entirely different world. Forget the temperate forests and Mediterranean coasts of today. This was a land of endless frozen steppes stretching thousands of kilometers in every direction. The few patches of woodland that survived were isolated refugees in a sea of ice and grass. Winter, temperatures plummeted to levels that would kill most modern mammals within hours. This was the mammoth steppe, a frigid grassland ecosystem that had no modern equivalent, supporting megafauna that seem almost mythical today. Asia presented perhaps the most complex landscape of all. Arid steppes in the west gradually transitioned into eastern woodlands, while the south harbored dense tropical forests that teemed with life. This environmental diversity created countless ecological niches, each supporting its own unique community of species. From the frozen wastes of Siberia to the steaming jungles of Southeast Asia, this continent was a mosaic of survival strategies. And connecting these three great landmasses was the Middle East, a biological crossroads where African, European, and Asian species met, competed, and occasionally interbred. Despite its harsh dry climate punctuated by unpredictable wet phases, this region would become one of the most important corridors in human history. The valleys that occasionally greened with vegetation became lifelines, temporary oases that allowed species to migrate between continents. This was the stage, constantly shifting, brutally unforgiving, and teeming with opportunities for those clever enough to exploit them. And it was here that the drama of human evolution was about to reach its most critical act. When Titans walked the Earth, if you could somehow travel back to this period, the first thing that would strike you wouldn't be the cold or the landscape. It would be the sheer size of everything that moved. Earth, 300,000 years ago, was experiencing its last great age of giants. And these weren't the docile herbivores you see in modern nature documentaries. These were hyper-specialized killing machines and survival experts that had been perfected by millions of years of evolution. Africa. The savage garden. Africa, still the most biodiverse continent, was incomparably richer and more dangerous than it is today. The grasslands stretched to every horizon, and upon them, herds of herbivores created spectacles that defy modern imagination. Ancient elephants roamed in multiple subspecies, many substantially larger than their modern descendants, with tusks that curved outward like massive scimitars, some extending over 4 meters. These weren't gentle giants. They were aggressive, territorial, and perfectly capable of killing anything that threatened them, including our ancestors. The rivers swelled each rainy season with ancient hippos far more aggressive than today's species, primitive buffalo with horns that could gore a lion, and vast herds of antelope and zebra species that exist now only as fossil records. These herbivores weren't just plentiful, they were essential, forming the base of a predatory hierarchy more complex than anything that exists today. And at the top of that hierarchy, nightmares. The giant African hyena was considerably larger than modern spotted hyenas, with jaws powerful enough to crush the femur of an adult buffalo in a single bite. But here's what's truly terrifying. Recent fossil analysis has revealed they weren't just scavengers. Bone markings show these creatures were active pack hunters capable of bringing down prey as large as or larger than what lions could kill. Imagine encountering a pack of these in the dark, their bone-crushing jaws capable of dismembering a human in seconds. Ancient African lions prowled these same grasslands, significantly larger than modern lions, with males potentially weighing over 300 kilograms. They operated in larger prides and displayed far more aggressive hunting behaviors than their modern descendants. For early humans, the distant roar of these apex predators wasn't just frightening, it was a death sentence if you were caught in the open. Ancient cheetahs and leopards added to this predatory gauntlet, each perfectly adapted to exploit different niches in this hyper-competitive ecosystem. And let's not forget the Nile crocodiles lurking in every water source, capable of explosive attacks that could end a life in the time it takes to fill a water container. This was the environment where Homo sapiens emerged, not at the top of the food chain, but somewhere in the middle, constantly vulnerable, perpetually alert. Europe, the Ice Kingdom cross into Europe, and you'd enter the realm of cold-adapted megafauna that seem almost fantastical today. The woolly mammoth has become iconic, and for good reason. Standing over 4 meters tall at the shoulder, weighing up to 6 tons, covered in thick fur and insulating fat, with tusks that could curve more than 4 meters on the largest bulls, these were architectural marvels of biological engineering. They weren't just surviving the Ice Age, they were thriving in it, their massive bodies generating and retaining heat, even in temperatures that would kill modern elephants within days. Beside them grazed the woolly rhinoceros, equally impressive with its thick coat and massive frontal horn that could measure over a meter in length. Despite their herbivorous diet, these creatures were notoriously aggressive when threatened, capable of charging at speeds that would give a modern rhino a run for its money. But the true apex predators of Pleistocene Europe were the carnivores that haunt paleontological nightmares. The European cave lion stands as one of the largest felids that ever existed, roughly 20 to 25% larger than modern lions based on skeletal analyses. Some males may have weighed close to 400 kilograms. Ancient cave paintings from Chauvet depict these lions without manes, suggesting they were adapted for stealth in dense vegetation rather than pride displays on open plains. This was an ambush predator of devastating efficiency, capable of killing prey several times its size. Cave bears were another monster entirely. The largest individuals approached 1 ton. Imagine a grizzly bear, but nearly twice the size, with a skull that could crush bone like we crack walnuts. While primarily herbivorous or omnivorous based on isotope analysis, these bears were territorial and aggressive, especially when defending cubs or food caches. Packs of ancient wolves and cave hyenas completed this predatory guild, creating a competitive hierarchy where even the hunters had to watch their backs. Europe's frozen steppes were beautiful, brutal, and utterly unforgiving. Asia, the crossroads of megafauna. Asia's environmental diversity created the most ecologically complex region on the planet. In the dense forests of the east, ancient tigers, potentially as large as modern Siberian tigers or even larger, stalked prey through vegetation so thick that their stripes became perfect camouflage. Some populations showed enlarged canine teeth, possible evolutionary echoes of saber-toothed lineages, though this remains hotly debated among paleontologists. To the northwest, the magnificent Megaloceros, the giant deer, whose antlers could span over 3 meters, represented one of evolution's most spectacular examples of sexual selection. Adult males carrying antlers that weighed tens of kilograms had to be incredibly robust just to support these bony crowns, making them walking testaments to the power of mate choice in shaping biology. One of Asia's most remarkable giants was Stegodon, an ancient relative of elephants with long, straight tusks and a massive body adapted for forest environments. These creatures ranged across Southeast Asia to China, becoming a critical food source for large predators and eventually for early human hunters. The Asian steppes supported vast herds of ancient bison, primitive wild horses, and early camelids, all constantly migrating to follow seasonal resources. These herbivores were pursued by packs of ancient wolves and various large cats, creating predator-prey dynamics of staggering complexity. The Middle East, the meeting ground. The Middle East, during this period, functioned as a biological melting pot. Despite its generally arid climate, periodic wet phases created temporary grasslands, valleys filled with vegetation, and lakes that attracted migratory populations from 3 continents. Ancient horses, wild cattle, gazelles, and large cats moved through seasonally, creating brief windows of abundance followed by harsh scarcity. This region had already witnessed waves of earlier human species like Homo erectus, whose stone tools and campsites pepper the archaeological record. But at 300,000 years ago, this was still primarily a wild frontier, a testing ground where species from different continents competed for the same and where only the most adaptable survived. The emergence of something new. While giants ruled the land and predators dominated the night, something remarkable was happening in a small corner of Africa. A new kind of primate was appearing, one that looked deceptively similar to earlier human species but carried within it the seeds of something unprecedented. The earliest Homo sapiens emerged around 300,000 years ago, and we know this from extraordinary fossil discoveries like those at Jebel Irhoud in Morocco. These weren't modern humans as we'd recognize them on a street today, but they possessed enough of our characteristics to be classified as our direct ancestors. Physical form, between ancient and modern. Morphologically, these early Homo sapiens stood between 160 and 170 centimeters tall, roughly the height of average modern adults, but built considerably more robustly. Their musculature was denser, their bones thicker, their entire frame designed for endurance and physical resilience that would put modern athletes to shame. Their faces showed more prominent cheekbones and somewhat lower sloping foreheads compared to us, giving them an appearance that would seem distinctly archaic if you encountered them today. Yet their brain volume was comparable to ours, between 1,300 and 1,450 cubic centimeters. This is crucial because it tells us that the cognitive hardware for complex thought was already in place. The real transformation was happening inside the skull. Although still somewhat elongated posteriorly, their craniums had begun developing the rounded shape that would become characteristic of modern humans. A shape that accommodated larger frontal and parietal lobes associated with abstract reasoning, planning, and possibly the neural architecture for language. Did they have language? We can't know for certain, but multiple lines of evidence suggest something more sophisticated than the communication systems of earlier human species. Their hyoid bone, which anchors tongue muscles crucial for speech, resembles that of modern humans. Their brain architecture had regions analogous to Broca's and Wernicke's areas, and their social complexity, evidenced through archaeology, strongly implies symbolic communication. The safest conclusion? They possessed a proto-language, not the fully grammatical systems we use today, but sophisticated enough to convey strategies, warn of dangers, and transmit knowledge across generations. That capability alone made them formidable. Social architecture, the secret weapon, but physical and cognitive traits tell only part of the story. What truly set early Homo sapiens apart was how they organized themselves socially. These weren't random groups of primates stumbling through the wilderness. Archaeological evidence reveals highly structured communities with clear divisions of labor, sophisticated cooperation, and long-term planning abilities that most animals never develop. They lived as mobile hunter-gatherers, moving seasonally to exploit shifting food resources. Their stone tools, particularly les Valois tools, demonstrate remarkable technological sophistication. Creating these tools required preparing a stone core in advance, then striking precisely placed flakes from it. This wasn't random stone, smashing. This was engineering that required foresight, planning, and probably teaching. These sharp flakes were hafted onto wooden shafts to create spears and cutting tools effective for hunting and butchering large animals. Wear patterns on tool edges and cut marks on ancient bones show these weren't opportunistic scavengers. They were deliberate hunters coordinating attacks on dangerous prey. Fire mastery gave them a transformative advantage. While earlier human species had used fire sporadically, Homo sapiens employed it strategically, cooking food to increase caloric extraction, staying warm in cold climates, creating defensive perimeters against predators, clearing vegetation to manipulate landscapes, and even possibly driving game toward ambush points. Group sizes typically ranged from 20 to 40 individuals, small enough for everyone to know each other intimately, large enough to mount effective hunts and defense. Task division was flexible but clear. Some individuals specialized in hunting, others in gathering plant foods, some in tool manufacture, others in childcare. Archaeological sites show spatially distinct activity areas, places for toolmaking, cooking zones, butchering areas, revealing organizational complexity that requires both communication and shared understanding of goals. Perhaps most tellingly, skeletal evidence shows healed fractures and injuries that would have been debilitating during recovery. The fact that these individuals survived long enough for bones to heal proves that others cared for them, provided food, and protected them while they were vulnerable. This capacity for compassion and reciprocal altruism was rare in the Pleistocene world, but it became one of humanity's defining characteristics. A crowded planet. Here's something most people don't realize. Homo sapiens weren't alone. At 300,000 years ago, Earth was home to multiple human species, each adapted to different environments, each possessing unique survival strategies. Neanderthals were evolving in Europe and Western Asia, stocky, incredibly robust, with thick bones and barrel chests perfectly adapted to glacial climates. Their brains were actually slightly larger than those of Homo sapiens on average, and archaeological evidence reveals they created sophisticated stone tools, controlled fire expertly, hunted large game effectively, and even buried their dead with possible grave goods. Some evidence suggests they created symbolic art, though this remains contentious. The two species, Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, hadn't yet encountered each other at the 300,000-year mark, but their eventual meeting would prove fateful. When they finally crossed paths tens of thousands of years later, they didn't just compete, they interbred, leaving genetic signatures that persist in most modern non-African populations today. Denisovans remain mysterious, known primarily through DNA extracted from a handful of fossils in Siberia and Tibet. They were closely related to Neanderthals but adapted to different environments, possibly including high-altitude regions where low oxygen would kill most humans. Genetic analysis suggests they were large-bodied, but with so few fossils, much about them remains speculative. Other archaic human lineages, possibly including late-surviving Homo heidelbergensis populations and other unnamed branches, likely still existed in various regions, though the fossil record becomes increasingly sparse for this period. The key point? Earth 300,000 years ago wasn't dominated by a single human species. It was an evolutionary experiment with multiple human lineages coexisting, competing, and occasionally interbreeding, creating a genetic landscape far more complex than most people imagine. Among all these human species, Homo sapiens weren't the strongest, fastest, or most cold adapted. What they possessed was flexibility, the ability to thrive in a wider range of environments, to shift strategies when old approaches failed, to innovate rather than rely solely on instinct. That flexibility would prove decisive in the trials ahead. Survival at the knife's edge. Possessing intelligence and social coordination was necessary but not sufficient for survival in the Pleistocene. Every single day presented life-threatening challenges that could annihilate entire communities. The predator gauntlet. The most immediate danger came from predators, creatures that viewed early humans not as future world dominators but as potential meals. On African savannas, the roar of ancient lions in the distance wasn't ambient background noise. It was an emergency alarm that sent groups into defensive formations. These massive cats operated in coordinated prides, and a single attack could kill multiple individuals if the group was caught unprepared or separated. Giant hyenas posed an even more insidious threat. Unlike modern spotted hyenas that are primarily active at dusk and dawn, these larger predecessors may have been more aggressive nocturnal hunters. Their bone-crushing jaws could kill with a single bite to the skull or spine. Archaeological evidence of human remains bearing hyena tooth marks confirms they didn't hesitate to prey on our ancestors when opportunities arose. Near water sources, essential for survival, Nile crocodiles represented explosive danger. A human bending to fill a water container could be seized and dragged under in less time than it takes to scream. This made even basic survival tasks like drinking fraught with mortal risk. Leopards and ancient cheetahs added aerial and ambush threats. Leopards were particularly dangerous because of their habit of stashing kills in trees and their willingness to hunt at night. A human sleeping even slightly separated from the group's fire could be targeted. As Homo sapiens groups expanded northward into colder regions, they encountered entirely different predator guilds. European cave lions, those massive ambush predators, potentially weighing 400 kilograms, could kill a human with a single swipe. Cave bears, despite being primarily herbivorous, were aggressively territorial and could inflict devastating injuries if encountered near den sites or food caches. Packs of ancient wolves and cave hyenas created constant competitive pressure. These weren't just predators hunting other prey. They were direct competitors for the same carcasses and resources that humans needed to survive. Strategic thinking, the human edge against such overwhelming physical disadvantages, early Homo sapiens had only one reliable weapon: their minds. Analysis of ancient hunting sites reveals sophisticated strategic thinking. They didn't just chase prey randomly, they studied animal behavior, identified weaknesses, and planned ambushes with multiple contingencies. Evidence from butchery sites shows they drove herbivores toward natural obstacles: cliffs where panicked animals would fall to their deaths, swamps where heavy creatures would become mired, narrow valleys where escape routes were limited. These techniques required scouting terrain in advance, coordinating group movement with precision timing, and maintaining discipline even when frightened animals charged directly at hunters. Levallois tools represent another cognitive leap: the ability to envision a finished product before beginning the creation process. Making these tools required preparing a stone core carefully, understanding the angles and force needed to strike precise flakes, and having the patience to reject imperfect results. This wasn't just tool use, this was manufacturing with quality control. Fire technology expanded their survival envelope dramatically. A group with a well-maintained fire could survive in regions that would otherwise kill them. The light deterred predators, the heat prevented hypothermia, the smoke could be used for signaling, and the cooked food provided dramatically more calories from the same raw materials. Perhaps most importantly, early Homo sapiens cared for each other in ways rare among Pleistocene species. Fossil evidence of healed fractures proves that injured individuals received prolonged care, being fed, protected, and kept with the group despite being unable to contribute for weeks or months. This reciprocal altruism created resilient communities where temporary setbacks didn't necessarily mean death. Task specialization also emerged. While some individuals hunted, others gathered plant foods, processed hides, manufactured tools, or tended fires. This division of labor meant the group was never entirely dependent on a single food source or skill set, providing redundancy that buffered against failure. Climate. The invisible enemy predators were terrifying, but climate fluctuations may have posed an even greater existential threat. The Pleistocene glacial cycles created climate swings that could transform entire regions within a few generations. A valley that supported abundant game and edible plants during a wet phase could become a barren desert within a human lifetime during a drought cycle. Extended dry periods in Africa caused rivers to shrink, vegetation to die back, and herbivore herds to migrate far beyond the range of a single human group. Communities that couldn't adapt to shifting resources faced starvation. Archaeological evidence suggests that some regions that were densely populated with human groups during wet phases became completely abandoned during extreme droughts, the groups either migrating or dying out entirely. Conversely, unusually wet periods could create flooding that destroyed camps, fostered disease, and made travel through certain regions impossible. The constant climate instability meant that no single survival strategy worked indefinitely. Flexibility wasn't just advantageous, it was mandatory. This climate volatility created what evolutionary biologists call selection pressure, environmental conditions that ruthlessly eliminate any organisms without the capacity to adapt rapidly. Homo sapiens were being forged in this crucible, with every generation winnowed down to those individuals and groups most capable of strategic thinking, cooperation, and innovation. The first exodus. No species can survive long-term by remaining static. As climate fluctuations made certain regions periodically uninhabitable, some Homo sapiens groups began making the most consequential decision in human history: leaving Africa. This wasn't a single mass migration with a clear starting date. Instead, it was probably multiple small group movements, most of which ended in failure and death, with only a handful eventually succeeding. Windows of opportunity, climate modeling, and paleo-environmental data suggest that migration was only possible during specific windows when conditions aligned favorably. Extended rainy periods could temporarily green the Sinai Peninsula, creating a vegetated corridor connecting Africa to the Middle East. Similarly, glacial periods lowered sea levels enough to make the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the southern gateway to Arabia, much narrower and potentially crossable. These windows were brief and unpredictable. A group attempting migration during a drought phase would face waterless deserts stretching hundreds of kilometers. But a group moving during a wet phase might find temporary oases, seasonal water sources, and enough game to sustain them through the crossing. Two pathways to destiny. The primary migration routes were the northern corridor through Sinai and the southern route across the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. Each presented unique challenges. The northern route meant traversing arid landscapes with scattered water sources, facing new predator species, and competing with other human populations, possibly late Homo heidelbergensis or other archaic groups, already established in the Levant. Success required careful timing, substantial group coordination, and probably a degree of luck. The southern route involved crossing a strait that, even at lower sea levels, still required some form of watercraft or opportunistic wading during extreme low tides. This implies early Homo sapiens may have possessed rudimentary nautical knowledge far earlier than traditionally assumed, though direct evidence for this remains elusive. Archaeological evidence confirms that by around 100,000 to 200,000 years ago, Homo sapiens populations had definitely established themselves outside Africa, but earlier attempts, closer to our 300,000-year mark, remain more speculative, based on ambiguous fossil finds and genetic modeling that suggests multiple dispersal waves over time. Encountering the others. Once beyond Africa, migrating Homo sapiens entered territories occupied by other human species. In the Middle East and eventually Europe, they would encounter Neanderthals, a species that had occupied these regions for hundreds of thousands of years and knew the landscape intimately. Later, genetic evidence proves these encounters weren't always hostile. Interbreeding occurred, leaving Neanderthal genetic signatures in modern non-African populations. But at 300,000 years ago, the two species hadn't yet met. That fateful intersection was still tens of thousands of years in the future. What's certain is that migration wasn't simply movement across landscapes, it was a brutal evolutionary filter. Groups that adapted to new environments, new prey species, new predators, and new climates survived and reproduced. Those that couldn't perished, leaving no genetic legacy. Each migrating group was an evolutionary experiment, their genes carrying modifications that would either prove adaptive or fatal in novel environments. Forged in fire. The world 300,000 years ago was a crucible, a testing ground where only the most adaptable, intelligent, and cooperative species could survive. Homo sapiens weren't the strongest or the fastest. They weren't the best climbers or swimmers. They didn't have the thickest fur or the sharpest claws. What they had was something far more powerful: the ability to imagine different futures and then work collectively to make those futures real. Every night spent around a fire, planning the next day's hunt, was an exercise in abstract thinking. Every tool carefully crafted to make future tasks easier was an act of foresight. Every injured individual nursed back to health was a statement that compassion and cooperation mattered more than immediate survival efficiency. These weren't the behaviors of animals operating on instinct. These were the behaviors of creatures capable of culture, the ability to transmit knowledge, values, and innovations across generations through teaching rather than purely through genetic inheritance. While giant animals still dominated the physical landscape, a quieter revolution was unfolding in the minds of a small, vulnerable primate species. They were learning not just to survive their environment, but to understand it, manipulate it, and eventually transform it entirely. The megafauna, those spectacular giants that had ruled for millions of years, would eventually meet their end, many at the hands of human hunters equipped with ever more sophisticated weapons. But at 300,000 years ago, that dominance was still unimaginable. Our ancestors were simply trying to make it through another night without being eaten. The irony is profound. The species that would eventually reshape the entire planet started as one of the most vulnerable creatures alive. Every advantage that would later make us dominant, language, technology, cooperation, cultural transmission, was initially developed not for conquest, but for survival. Echoes across time. The story of Earth 300,000 years ago is ultimately a story about us, about where we came from, and what we had to overcome to get here. It's humbling to realize that our ancestors weren't inherently special. They were simply primates, trying to avoid being eaten, trying to find enough food, trying to keep their children alive long enough to have children of their own. The fact that they succeeded, that they not only survived, but eventually thrived, is a testament to the power of adaptability, intelligence, and cooperation. The giant animals are gone now, most vanished within the last 50,000 years in waves of extinction that closely followed human expansion across continents. The other human species, though they live on in fragments of DNA within those of us descended from populations that interbred with them. What remains is us, Homo sapiens, the only surviving human species, now numbering over 8 billion and dominating every terrestrial ecosystem on the planet. But our success came with a price. The same cognitive abilities that allowed us to survive the Pleistocene now enable us to transform the planet's climate, drive other species to extinction, and create technologies that could either elevate humanity to unimaginable heights. We are the descendants of prey animals who became predators, of vulnerable creatures who learned to cooperate so effectively they became unstoppable, of primates who discovered that imagination and planning could overcome physical weakness. The challenges we face today are different. Climate change, resource depletion, pandemic disease, technological risk. But the solutions require the same qualities that saved our ancestors: adaptability, foresight, cooperation. Earth 300,000 years ago was a world of giants and ice, of multiple human species competing for survival, of climate swings that could annihilate entire populations within a generation. Our ancestors faced this brutal world with nothing but their wits, their tools, and each other. They didn't know they were participating in one of the greatest evolutionary success stories the planet has ever witnessed. They were just trying to survive until tomorrow. And somehow, improbably, impossibly, they did. Their legacy is you, reading these words, contemplating the vast sweep of time that connects us to that harsh, magnificent world. The journey is far from over. The story continues. And the next chapter, that's up to us.